our lead, one Perek a day. Thank you so much for being with us. And we are about to begin Perek test of Hilchos Sefer Torah, which is going to discuss a very interesting din. The way we know a Sefer Torah in general is the following. We know the Sefer Torah as two Atzechayim, and it has the Sefer Torah written in the middle. We are now going to describe the Sefer Torah as if it's rolled only on one. Yeah, sees it? Only on one. And then what we're going to measure is the circumference of this entire roll. So when you roll up the whole Sefer Torah on one, as one roll, take a string and measure how long it is. So it's going to be double what you see because it goes around the other side. The length of that string, that's how high the Sefer Torah should be. Very interesting din brought in Gemara. And now let's see it inside. Zok the Rambam. Ein oisin Sefer Torah. Initially, lechatchila, we don't make a Sefer Torah loy arka yoser al kefay. The length, meaning the height of the cloth, should not be bigger than the circumference, the string that goes around the whole Sefer Torah as it's rolled up on one. V'loy hekefay yoser al arka, and vice versa. The width shouldn't be. That means the circumference of the width of the Sefer Torah shouldn't be more than the height. The kamo orkoi. So what is optimal? The best length, that means the height of the Sefer Torah, big vil, if you're doing it with thick vil, which is when you take the hide and you don't split it into two, rather you just use it and cleans the side of the flesh and clean the side of the hair, and you write it on the side of the hair, that's called vil. So that's the type of cloth you're using. It should be 6 tvachim. That's how high, and that means that's how wide it should be. Shehem arba basar boy 6 tvachim. The Rambam later on going to go into the details of how big each etzba. We're talking about a gudlin. It's 24 etzbois beroich bagudel shel yad on the 24 times a thumb of your average person. That is big vil. And if it's on cloth is when you take the high, you split it into two, and you use the outer layer, which is close to the hair, and then in that case you write it on the inside, where it's facing inside. That's called cloth. So in cloth, it could be a little more, a little less. V'hushia arka kefay, providing that the height is the same size as the circumference. Doesn't need to be dafka 6 tvachim like it is when it's made from vil. V'chenim also big vil pachas mishish tvachim. You should know that if with vil you did less than 6 tvachim, umiyat aksav. And how did you make that happen? Because you wrote in more slim letters. Umiyat aksav made it less. Or yita al shisha, or you're writing v'hirchib aksav, you wrote it break there with more spaces or bigger letters, and therefore it's more than 6 tvachim. But again, the same 6 tvachim that go around, that's the same height. Achia orkoi kekefa hereze kamitzvah. You have been yoytzi, fulfilled this special mitzvah of orkoi kekefa, that its height should be the same size as its circumference. Now the Rambam is going to go at a great length to plan out an entire Sefer Torah for us, how you can set up your columns in a way that at the end of writing the entire Sefer Torah, you're going to have the width, the circumference, the same size as the height of it. Dr. Shira Giloin Milmata, generally, when you have the margin on the bottom, that should be 4 etzbois, 4 thumb widths. Olamailo shalosh etzbois. And above the margin on top of the writing should be 3. Ubein daf ladaf. Between each column should be 2 etzbois, 2 thumb widths. Therefore, if you're writing the columns and the mamish almost to the end of the parchment, in order that the next cloth that you put near it, it'll have between both columns one agudel from each one. Hence, it has 2 between each column. Now, in addition to the extra gudel that you're leaving by the beginning of each Yeriya, you also have to leave a little bit to be able to sew the 2 Yeriyas together. When after you finish sewing both parchments together, let's call them like both parchment boards, like Bristol boards. When you sew them both together, between every column throughout the entire Sefer Torah, even where the 2 parchments connect, 2 etzbois. That's the minimum. In addition, you have to leave at the beginning of the entire scroll of the Sefer Torah, and at the end, to roll it up onto the Atzechayim. Now, all these shiurim that the Rambam introduced as mandatory. You should know that they're for a specific mitzvah, but they're not. They won't invalidate the Sefer Torah. If you did add, that means it's more than the circumference or it's less than the circumference, the height. It's still going to be okay, and it's loy possible. Now, how does a man plan out this Sefer Torah? That its length, namely the height, is kekeva like its circumference. Start by taking all the hides and square them out, and they should all be the exact same square, the same length and height. And that's why it's exactly square. And each hide, each cloth should be 6 by 6. Ketzav echad l'chol echad. This should be the same. Ketzav can mean rhythm, but it means the same size for each one of them. After you sew them together, you roll them, and it should be equal on top of the bottom. You roll them into one roll that's tightly rolled. And then you add, that means that's the first one. You add another hide and you start rolling when it's all on it, because then there's more spaces. Until after you're rolling, once you reach 6 tfachim, which means 3 in the front and 3 in the back, at that point, what you do is, that's the width of all the hides. You should measure it with a silk chut or a wool chut, that you go around the entire roll. Now, now the Rambam is going to describe, you are going to need a tape measure or a measuring stick, a ruler, in order to know how to split up your oisius and your columns. So the entire Sefer Torah will fit into this roll that you wrote. Because if you're going to write a Sefer Torah and you're going to write it too small, the letters, it's not going to fill all these parchments. So it doesn't help the fact that you just made them 6 tfachim is the circumference and 6 tfachim is the height. If not, the whole Sefer Torah is written. You don't need a whole bunch at the end to be go onto the. So what do you do? So now Zalman is going to describe this how you make a measuring stick. Take a glat, a flat reed or a flat plank of wood stick. It should be the length of 40 or 50 thumb widths. You should make markings for every etzba. It means for every gudel, every half of a gudel, and then after that half, like we have on our rulers, that broken down into 4 or 5. So v'lashloisha ol arba chalakim, each etzba should be split into 4 or 5 parts. This will help you to know or to measure the amount of a half an etzba and a quarter of an etzba. And based on this, whatever nominations you want to break it down to. Now, now you measure all the hides that you have rolled in with this measuring stick. So that you know how many etzbois, how many agudels there are in each hide, and you know how much there is in the entire Sefer Torah. And now you're going to figure out how wide you write in a column. So you're going to plan out the entire Sefer Torah, how many columns you're going to have, and based on that, how much space to leave in the middle. Now test yourself. Take different heights. You want to test the amount of your writing. You write one column. Says the Rambam, it's known to everybody. The length of each column is 17 agudlin. Because you're anyways going to be leaving 4 on top, which reaches 20, and shows lamata and arba lamata is 24, yeah. But that we know how high the column is going to be, but how wide are you going to make each column, and how much margin space are you going to leave? That depends on your handwriting. So he says, it's based on your handwriting. Do you write very thin or very thick? And how many lines you're going to fill in these etzba'os, that's the height of each column. That's also dependent on your writing. Between each line, there's another line. Empty one. After you figured out how much writing you cram into one column, now take read that measuring stick and measure how many columns you need throughout the whole Torah and mark for yourself how big the margins are going to be based on your handwriting. And make sure there's at least 2 etzbos between every column. Now, based on this, you decide how wide your columns are. How many columns? How much columns you need in this entire roll based on the width of the column that you wrote. And then you know how many columns you have. You'll know how much in the entire Torah. And you'll evaluate based on what you wrote. You're being maitik. You're copying from a different Sefer Torah. That's the din, right? You have to copy mitech ksav. So check on the Sefer Torah how much you covered in your one column from the Sefer Torah from which you're copying, and based on that, make the evaluation how many columns are in that Sefer Torah, how much you're going to need in your type of writing in your Sefer Torah. Now, if based on your calculation and the way you all set it up, your columns and the margins, it's going to fill up the entire roll that you made sure is the same circumference as the height, then you're good to go. You're a billionaire. If you figured out 1 second, there's extra dapim in the Torah because you write smaller. You're going to have to broaden your ksav so it fills up until you have less columns. So again, go back to the planning room, take another page and start writing wider. So you can always remind yourself how wide you're writing. And what happens if the Torah requires more dapim that you didn't have in this roll? So you might so now to go back to the planning room and start writing thinner so it should fit into this circumference. You check each daf until you figure out that all the columns, that means all these columns you check until you reach, that's the cheshbon that you made. And after you know the width that you're meant to be writing and what type of writing, then you could start writing in this kerech. This kerech means this roll that you have planned should be the same circumference as the height. Now, halacha zayin, a little technical. And the Rambam Mamish is kakot and kagadol. Make sure we know everything we need to know what Torah is about. Pastor Rambam describes it to us. Halacha zayin. Umechalakol or va'or dapim besirtu. Now, after you split each yiriyah, each height based on columns, now you start making sirtut. You scrape in based on the width of the columns that you planned and you calculated. You start making the width of each one. When you have 3 or 4 etzbois left in the final daf and once you reach the end and you already finished all your columns, leave the amount of etzbois you need. In addition to the amount to be goylal that we mentioned, leave another etzba okidei tfira, an additional etzba besides wrapping it onto the stick, and in addition to that gudel, that etzba kidei tfira, the amount to sew it onto the stick, v'yakot sashar, and cut off the rest. Don't be choishish. Don't be worried about the fact that you're going to afterwards have to add for whatever you're cutting. The ksav is going to fit in based on the amount of dapim. So you added more, you took off more, you'll make it fit. Now, halacha ches. All this whole description was based on the understanding that you want to make it 6 tfachim, so it's 3 and then 3 in the back, that's the circumference, and then the height is 6. So if you're planning to make a smaller Sefer Torah because you wanted to carry on, because you're working in Misaskim, and you want everybody to be able to have in their house, or the you're king, and you want to carry it the whole time with you. So based on that, plan it. More or less than 6. That's the way you plan yourself out with that ruler stick that you made. It'll end up being, if you follow my my plan, you'll have the length, which is the height of the Sefer Torah, will be the same kefer, like its circumference. Now, as long as you make sure that your math is correct and you maintain our system, says the Rambam. Now the Rambam is going to go seemingly on a tangent, describe when we say etzbois, how big is the etzba, the gudel, the thumb. All the gudel that we referred to, the thumbs that we referred to, their width is and this is going to be the measuring we're going to mention in regards to many other dinim throughout the entire Yad HaChazaka. It's the average middle-sized thumb, not someone too big and not too small. And we've already been medactic and narrowed it down to a specific marker. It's 7 middle-sized kernels of barley kernels. And that's, when is it 7? When they're pressed together, all the 7, they're sitting together, their width is going to be a gudel. And they are the length of 2 sa'oiris when they're just sitting there with extra space. Every time I tell you a handbreadth, the handbreadth is the size of 4 such thumbs. That's going to mount the general tefach that Torah refers to. The chol amma, and anytime I mention amma, says the Rambam, it's referring to 6 of such tefachim. So 6 tefachim, which each one has 4 agudlim, which each agudl is 7 sa'oiris b'doichak, 7 barley kernels that are pressed together. That's the amounts that Torah refers to. Now, the Rambam is going to describe his own Sefer Torah. Halacha Yud, Sefer Torah shechsafti ani, the Sefer Torah that I wrote, roichav kol daf v'daf midapov, each column from all its columns is arba etzbois, is the size of a tefach, 4 etzbois. The shir sayam, the shir sazinu, the shira of Bishal as Yasher and Shir Sazino Roichav Kol Daf Men Sheish Etzbois. Each one is 6 Etzbois, an additional 2 Gudlin. How many lines were there on each daf? 51 lines. How many hides? Klafim were there. Masayim B'Shisha V'Esrim Daf. 226 hides. The Oirich Kol Sefer. How long was the entire Sefer in? As the Rambam told us to measure how many etzbois. It's 1,000 v'shishim v'sheish etzbois v'kiruv. It's 1,366 etzbois. Close to that, because he said there's also reichav etzba. Elo ashesha etzbois hayiseiros b'cheshbon lagilion. When we mentioned at the beginning that you have to add another 6 gudlim for the margins at the side to wrap on. Everything I was referring to, says the Rambam, this is oiris elam, ram skin. If you want to write on different hides or close to this, it's less 1 or 2. This I'm saving you, says the Rambam. The entire math I'm sparing you. Just do this amount if you plan to write this size columns and plan the Sefer Torah from which you're copying, make the whole cheshbon. If you have this amount, that's the arka kekef. So I saved you the amount of time you're going to need to calculate how many hides and how high, and then figure yourself out with how big your writing is that you fit into those margins, that amount of. Now, halacha yud beis. On one hide, you should not make less than 3 columns. And you shouldn't make more than 8. Less than 3 could look like patches as a middle. It looks like writing, continuous writing. If you have a urea that is more than 8, namely 9, so split it in 2. 4 and 5, two different hides they'll be. In which case do we say that's betchilas sefer be'emtza, that you could split it? Even if it's one pasuk, you leave it its own complete daf. Don't cut it down. And you sew it onto the rest of the years. It should be the same size as all the previous ones. Is when you're sewing these hides together, these cloths together. And they have to be sewn with the sinews of a behema, that they are kosher. Even if they died of different causes, they weren't shechted properly. meaning you wouldn't be able to eat it as kosher, but their species is kosher. And he says, Kider Shatayv not tefillin, the same halacha as we mentioned in regards to tefillin, sewing the tefillin box is closed. This is halacha that we received from the oral Torah, passed down to us from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way dating back to Sinai. If you sewed it not with sinews, or with sinews, but of a non-kosher behema, pasul, it is invalid. You have to untie them, and you sew it again. Based on halacha. Now halacha yud gimel. Kshetayfrin kol yiris ein tayfrin kol yiris kula mitchilas avat seifa. When you're sewing two parchments together, don't sew it from the top all the way till the bottom. You start sewing, let's say, an inch in. Don't sew all the way till the top. Leave an inch at the bottom and an inch at the top that are not sewn. For what reason? If a person is tightening it too much, or a person is doing hagbeh, and it's starting to put pressure, if it's tied very tight, it may rip in the middle of a yiriyah. That's terrible. Middle of a yiriyah may rip the Eibish's name. So that way, because there's an opening, it's so to speak a weak point, and when it starts pulling and putting pressure on one area, it's going to rip by the area, and you sew it again. So when you roll it, it shouldn't rip in the middle of the area. But you make, as we've described, two atzechayim, two holders of wood, one at the beginning, one at the end. I mean, this entire cheshbon of rolling it as one, that was just when you planned the Torah. But Lamaisa, the kefay, it's going to be two separate, two rolls, one from each side. You use sinews to sew these parchments onto these pillars or these atzechayim, so it should be rolled. It should roll onto this pole, otherwise it doesn't catch. And you have to make sure, as the Rambam said, you need 6 gudlim, because you have to farther the writing, the columns from the written columns from the end. And the final halacha for today, the way I understand halacha, if you have a parchment that was ripped through the parchment, if it ripped within 2 lines, so you could erase those 2 lines and rewrite them. This is the way I understand, because Sefer doesn't need to be written Kesidron. And B'meila, you're not erasing Hashem's name. Now, B'soich Shalish, however, it goes through 3 lines. You erase 3, it's going to look like a patch. It's going to be noticeable, not nice. And Lo Yitfar, you shouldn't sew it again. But Medvar Mamorim, in which cases we say you shouldn't sew it, and it's going to look mudna, is B'she'ein Be'ein Aftzuniker. When the afotzim, as we described, is galnut concoction that was cooked, and the water that processes the hide, it's so old that it starts losing its effect on the hide, and therefore when you're gonna sew it, you'll see that it's different over there, because it's different inside the. It didn't process that deep, but it starts losing its effect. If when it's ripped, you still notice that it's processed, it won't look like a new patch in the middle. Toifer, you're allowed to sew it back. Even if it went through 3 lines. Between words, not if it cut on the words, between the words or between the lines that you could sew. All these rips ain't toifer nice and el begidin. They have the same din like 2 parchments. They need to be sewn together. With gidin, as you have sewn the parchments one to another. Anytime you're sewing together parchments, ensure that you're not deducting a letter that's getting excluded while you're covering it over, folding it, or whatever it is, or you're not making any ois change its tzura. When we have a mistake today, there's a different way of doing it. Obviously, it needs to be considered, where they could cut it out and stick from the back other parchment. Then it's considered part of one parchment. That also works. Thank you so very much for being with our very special and unique Chabura, going through the entire Torah Shabbat Peh with the Rambam in our lead. Yishakar to our tech team led by Rav Levin and Ravsky. Looking forward to see you at next year. Hatzlacha Rabbah.